Hey everybody, it's Dr. Sandra here. So I wanted to do a quick video about how to increase bone mineral density in your hips. This is a big problem that we see, especially in older adults, but interestingly enough, we also see it in elite athletes. Which ones? We actually see this in cyclists. And why? It's because they're not getting the forces throughout the day because of their intense training where they're seated and they're cycling all the time. They're not getting those really important ground force reactions to go through that hip joint to signal to the joint and the bones to actually increase in size because of the impact on the ground from walking. So walking is a really therapeutic exercise. It's a requirement of the body in order to have strong bone in the hip area. The really neat thing about building bone mineral density is that it's very specific. You don't just build it all over the place. It's just like muscle, where whatever area of the body is getting this signal where you're hitting the ground, getting ground force reaction through this bone, this bony area, your cells will signal to each other. It's really important we lay down more bone. The way that it works with bone is we have something called osteoclasts and osteoblasts with a B. So osteoclasts, like you can think of consume bone. So you want to break down the bone so that you can build up new, stronger bone. So osteoblasts create new bone tissue. Some of the medications that we see with people who have thin bones or osteoporosis is that it builds up the bone, but it doesn't break down the bone. So it preserves what you have, but what you have might be old and brittle. You want to be continually recycling your bone cells so that they're strong and they're robust. And that's what we saw in some of the older osteoporosis medication to build stronger bones. Another misconception that people have is that if they have osteoporosis, they have it all over their body. That is a misconception. So if you are getting the diagnosis of osteoporosis, you want to ask your doctor, where specifically do you have low bone mineral density? And then what you can do is specific exercises to build up bone mineral density in that area. And a lot of the time, the first thing that you're going to want to focus on is improving your alignment. So if you're standing forward and your weight's through your toes versus your heels, automatically you're going to miss getting those forces through the hip joint, which are so important. Again, the only way we can change is through cell communication. And if those cells aren't getting communicated through the ground force reaction, they're not going to know that they need to build up their bone mineral density. So the first thing that you want to do is change your shoe wear from something with a heel to something with a zero heel drop. And what that just means is that the front part of the foot is equal to the back part of the foot. So a really good example of this would be Ultra shoes. I recommend Ultra shoes as a transitional shoe from wearing something with a heel, which all gym shoes have, all running shoes have. Most of your shoes are going to have a little bit of a heel, even like Uggs and popular boots. So you really have to do your research. And there's a lot of people out there now that are into zero drop and minimal base shoes because of the health impact it has on their feet and therefore the rest of their body. So it's pretty easy to find websites and brands that sell shoes with zero heel drop, but you just have to look. And if you reach out to me, I'm happy to provide you with that information. But the shoe that I recommend most to start off with for people is a shoe by a company called Ultra, ALTRA. The reason why I like them is because they have a lot of cushion and padding in their shoes, so it's very comfortable for your feet. And it just feels more spacious, it feels cushy. There are several people that I work with that have transitioned to an Ultra shoe, and it has a wider toe box, so there's space for your toes. But most important for our video today and what we're talking about is that it allows the heel to be even with the forefoot, so that when you're standing, you can back your hips up so that your hip joint falls over your ankle joint. And every time we take a step, we want our hip joint to be back, so that the ground force reaction, when we step over that foot during our gait pattern, the ground force reaction drives up through that weak part of our hip and signals to it to increase the bone there. If you consistently walk in shoes that have a little heel on them, you're just going to not get as much of a ground force reaction signal. So you're really kind of cheating yourself and your hips by not signaling the true weight-bearing bone amount that you need. So I would start there with getting zero drop shoes, and then the second thing is going to be to back your hips up so that your hips are not in front of your ankles. A really common stance for posture for people is to stand with their hips in front of their ankles. This uses less energy, so it's more energy efficient. So it makes sense why people would do it, to kind of hang on their hips. But again, you're going to miss that ground force reaction, which is so important to signal for growth of the new bone. And just because you're 50 years old or 75 years old or 20 years old doesn't mean that you have a 20-year-old skeleton. Our skeletons are constantly recycling ourselves with osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So we're breaking down the bone and building up new bone. So it's not like it stays stagnant, it's fluid, especially in the areas that are getting this ground force reaction. That's where we're cycling through new bone. If you're not moving and you're not giving the bone the signal that it needs to be strong and robust, then you're not going to recycle your bone and you're not going to continually build new bone cells. So it's really important that you move and move correctly with zero heel drop shoes and with your heels down and your hips back over your heels in order to get more bone in the right places and the most important places. So I would start with alignment. And then finally, you want to look at your diet and just make sure that you are consuming enough foods. Really important that your body is very well nourished to provide these essential nutrients. Some of the important ones for bone building are going to be vitamin D and magnesium. So you can ask your doctor about those supplements for building more bone, or do some of the research on your own to find out what levels are right for you. I did do a video about some supplements you may want to consider, so you can check that video out above. But in general, you want to make sure that you're getting a well-balanced diet and eating mineral-rich foods to help build that bone density. So just to wrap it up, the most important thing is going to be to change your alignment so that every time you take a step, you're signaling to your body that you want to build bone density in this, especially the hip area. That's one of the most frequent areas of low bone density. But you can also find it in your wrists, because we're not really weight bearing on our wrists as much as we used to, or our ancestors did. We're not hanging from trees, we're not hanging. So hanging can be a really good exercise, or being in an all fours position on the floor to weight bear through your wrists to build up that strength. Also, our ribs are an area that's susceptible to fracture no matter what your age, and that's just because we're not really breathing and expanding our chest and allowing our rib cage to go in and go out. So what would increase bone mineral density in your ribs? It would be the pull of the intercostal muscles on those bones when you're breathing, using your entire chest rib cage capacity and not just shallow breathing in your collarbones. So pay attention to your breath and make sure that you can expand your ribs if it's important to you to increase your bone mineral density in your ribs. You can also, many people have low bone mineral density in their spine, and again, backing those hips up so that your hips are over your ankles is going to help get you in proper alignment so that the low back and your vertebra are signaled to have more stimulus and improve their bone mineral density by laying down new bone, getting rid of the old bone and building new bone. So I just wanted to review some of the important points that we talked about earlier. So again, when you are walking, when you're standing, you want the ground force reaction to go through your femur bone, okay? Especially that greater trochanter area. And when you are standing forward of your hips like this, you're not going to get that ground force reaction where we want it. As you saw earlier with this plumb line, when my weight is back in my heels, the ground force reaction goes through my ankle. But when I lean forward and put my weight even just slightly forward, so I'm hanging on my hips, which is a really common stance for a lot of people, you can see that the plumb line goes in front of my ankle. And so the ground force reaction isn't going to go through that hip joint anymore. So it's really important that you, number one, get some shoes where you can sit back into your heel. You want to get some zero drop shoes. I like these Vibram 5 fingers. They are pretty minimal, so if you're not used to something like that, then you want to start with the Ultra brand, which I talked about earlier and recommended. Start with that. It's going to be a nice wide toe box, zero drop foot, and lots of cushioning. So you can just go out to their website and they have free returns, so you don't have to worry about the wrong size. And then when you're standing, just get in the habit of not hanging on your hips, but backing your hips up. That's gonna go, you'll start to notice if you watch people that their hips are forward. And if they have even a little bit of a heel, I'm talking like half an inch, that's gonna change your alignment, so you're not gonna get those ground force reactions through the ideal part of your hip if you're trying to build your bone mineral density in your hip. So I just wanted to go over a few more exercises that you can do to increase the mineral density specifically in the hips. So let's get into that. The first thing that you're going to want to do is stand with your feet hip width apart. We already went over this ad nauseum, but it's really important that you keep your feet straight and back your weight up so that your hip falls over the heel. And again, you can't be wearing any footwear with a heel in it in order to back your weight so that it's over your heels. If you're forward on your toes, you're not going to be able to get that ground force reaction, okay? So make sure you get the zero drop shoes. You can ask me about those if you're not sure what to get, and then practice standing with your feet back over your heels. The next thing that you're going to want to do is just gently shift from side to side. So you're putting weight gently through one leg and then through the other. You do not need to lift your feet off the floor. You can keep both feet fully on the floor. Again, you're going to be about hip width apart with your feet. Your toes are spread nice and wide. You're pushing into the whole part of your foot. So not at the toes, more so back in the heels. Make sure your hips are pushed back so that you can get that ground force reaction up through your hip. As you get a little bit better at this, and if you haven't had a hip replacement, you can start to lift the heel off the ground so that you're moving more weight onto that one leg. So you're going to get more signaling to that bone to build up its density. Walking is one of the greatest exercises to signal increases in bone mineral density. So get those shoes with a zero heel drop, which means that the front of the shoe is the same as the back of the shoe. It's one level, okay? So you're gonna work towards holding this position up to a minute where you back your hips up, your ribs are down, you're trying to relax your thigh. You may need to hold on to something for balance. This isn't necessarily a balance exercise. We're trying to just build some strength around that hip. And then of course you can work up to the other side, a minute. So this is just a basic hip list. But you're not yanking, you're not pulling your leg up. You're letting everything just kind of hang and you're pushing through the standing leg. The standing leg is the leg that's getting the workout. And then finally, another exercise is the zombie walk. So you don't have to look like a zombie, but your lower half does, because you want to keep your feet hip width apart, knees straight, and you're going wide hip width, wide hip width, wide hip width. You're not going wide to narrow, wide to narrow. You want to maintain your feet hip width apart. Try to land on your heels, relax your thighs. Try to land with the whole foot, but again, you're not trying to put more weight through the front of the toes, which is kind of what a lot of us are used to doing. So bear weight through your whole foot. Make sure you're backing your hips up this whole time. Back those hips up. So if you try those 3 exercises, that will help you a long way to building your hip mineral density. And of course, go for those nice walks with your 0 ground new footwear. So that's all for me today. Again, let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.